All right, because all of you are at very different points in your law school journey, some of you with no idea how to begin the law school admissions process and feeling anxiety about that, others not sure whether you'll even apply to law school. I'm going to essentially try to speak to all parts of the law school journey and process. I'm going to go over all of that with you. For those of you that have yet to apply to law school, I'm going to share everything that you need to know about the different components of the law school application and how to leverage each component to your benefit. Because many law schools use a holistic review process, I want to make sure that you understand how exactly that works and how to make the most of it. And of course, I'm also going to share with you how to apply to law school itself. Okay, also forgive my light. The sun is going down and I'm facing the window right now, so it will probably be reflecting off my face really weird today. Before I begin, I do want to give a formal introduction. So my name is Akeisha Anderson. I actually am a legislative attorney based in Montgomery, Alabama. I currently work as a criminal justice reform lobbyist, which is my full-time job. And on the side, I run Anderson Admissions Academy, which is a business that I created to help first-generation, low-income, and underrepresented minority students navigate the law school admissions process. So Anderson Admissions Academy was essentially birthed as a result of two things. First, prior to my current job, I had the pleasure of serving as Associate Director of Admissions for UCLA School of Law. And in my role, I assisted with all phases of the law school admissions process, from recruitment to application review, advising prospective students, making admissions recommendations, making scholarship recommendations, and managing our waitlist. Although I left that job to pursue my current job in my first level policy work, I really did enjoy working in admissions a lot. One thing I will note, however, while working in admissions, it was not lost on me that oftentimes the applications that I was reading and the students that I were helping usually looked nothing like you and I. I often came across students, that came from lawyer families, and that didn't have the sort of background that I could relate to. So with Anderson Admissions Academy, I really wanted to be able to reach out to the sort of students that I rarely saw soon enough while working in admissions. So the students like I was once upon a time, those that were first in their family to get a college degree, are first in their family to get a law degree, those that didn't come from money or grow up super privileged, and especially minority students. So those are the people that I really cater towards in my business. My second motivation for starting a business is that I honestly hate the fact that the legal profession is not very diverse. For example, people that identify as Latinx make up over 18% of the US population, but only 5% of the legal profession. People that identify as Black make up over 13% of the US population, but only 5% of the legal profession as well. Even worse, nearly 50% of Black applicants are not accepted into a single law school when they apply. Also, people that identify as Asian make up over 5% of the US population, but only 2% of the legal profession. And I could just go on and on and on, but the stats really get even more dismal for other racial and minority groups. Also, beyond race, there is a huge economic or socioeconomic disparity between who gets into top law schools. So research has shown that about 40% of the students at top law schools come from the top 10% of the socioeconomic stratosphere. In contrast, only 5% of students at top law schools come from the bottom 25% of the socioeconomic stratosphere. So Anderson Admissions Academy in its own right is my way of trying to chip away at both of these forms of disparities and trying to further diversify law schools in the legal community. Anywho, to learn more about my business, definitely feel free to check out my website. It is on the screen. It is www.anderson.thinkific.com. And definitely go ahead and follow me on Instagram. I share a lot of great and free admissions related advice on there. My IG handle is Akeisha, Akiesha. And then in addition to running my business and Instagram page, I recently published a book entitled Applying While Black or Brown, Foundational Information that Minority, First Generation, and Low-Income Students Need to Know as they begin their law school journey. So if you all enjoy this presentation, definitely consider going on my website or visiting Amazon to purchase that book. Now that I have gotten all of my very many shameless plugs out, I'm gonna go ahead and actually begin the presentation. All right, so on the screen, you see the outcomes and expectations for today. The overall goal of this presentation is to do two things. First, I want to make sure that you all know the ins and outs of applying to law school, including how to put your best foot forward by making the most of the holistic review process. Second, I want you all to be aware of the many sorts of missteps and pitfalls that you ought to avoid so that you have the best chances of being admitted to the schools that you desire. Because you're going to hear me talk a lot about the holistic review process throughout this presentation, it seems most appropriate for me to begin by explaining what exactly that means. Sometimes, or I think oftentimes, applicants make the mistake of thinking that law school admission decisions are based solely on numbers, namely your LSAT score and GPA. However, I've come to find that that really isn't the case. So a holistic review process is a method of reviewing an applicant's file in its entirety before making a decision on whether they should be admitted or not. So I like to tell students to think of it this way. If it was all about the numbers, schools wouldn't need admissions officers or admissions committees to review your applications and to determine who should be admitted or not. Instead, schools could really use computers to just determine who's admitted, who's waitlisted, and who's rejected. But that's not the case. And it's not the case because it's not all about the numbers. While every school has median numbers, specifically a median GPA and a median LSAT score, keep in mind that medians are just a halfway point. They simply illustrate the score or GPA that half of the admitted students fell above or below. While it's good to aim for a school's median number, every year there are students with numbers above every school's medians or 75th percentiles even that don't get in, while there are also students with numbers below a school's median or even their 25th percentiles that do get admitted. So the more of the story is essentially to be realistic about the schools you're applying to, and later in the presentation, I'll discuss more how to kind of know whether or not you're being realistic, but also don't count yourself out based just on your numbers. All right, and so when thinking about the holistic review process, I think it's important to think of the things that a school is assessing as falling into two separate buckets. So bucket one is your hard factors. I also refer to these sometimes as your quantitative factors. So they're your numbers. They consist of your LSAT score and your undergraduate GPA. Bucket two is your soft factors, often referred to as your qualitative factors. And these are the things that aren't your numbers. They consist of everything else in your application packet, namely the things that paint a fuller picture of who you are. While it is true that most schools do place the most weight on your hard factors, I would say that hard factors actually only consist of approximately 2/3, give or take, of any admissions decision. So that means that about 1/3, give or take, of any admissions decision is determined by soft factors. And that is by no means insignificant. So for most applicants, soft factors truly are what really seals their admissions fate, for better or worse. And so I think it's important to know that as we start off, because it's important to understand why it's so important to make the most of the holistic review process by using your soft factors to your benefit every single chance that you get. All right, so now let's discuss the components of the law school application itself and how to apply to law school. Throughout this presentation, though, please remember what I just went over regarding hard factors and the fact that they are simply your LSAT score and undergraduate GPA. And keep in mind that everything else I discussed fall under the umbrella of soft factors, which means those are the things that you can really leverage to make a difference in your application or when applying to law schools. So when law schools receive your law school application, it is divided into two parts. So the credential assembly services, better known as CAS report, and your electronic application, often referred to as your EAPP. Those are the two parts of basically your application in total. So I'll discuss your application materials based on where they're found in the CAS report or in the EAPP. I'm going to start by discussing the CAS report, namely because that's the part of your application that admissions officers will typically review first. However, for those of you that have no clue where to start when it comes to applying to law school, write this website down. It is lsac.org, lsac.org. And LSAC stands for Law School Admissions Council, and LSAC is essentially the clearinghouse that collects all of your application materials from you and submits them to law schools on your behalf. It is free to create an LSAC account, but that is the very first thing you must do when you get ready to apply for law school. You also must take a standardized test to be considered for law school admissions. And so although some schools accept GRE scores, I don't recommend that you take the GRE in lieu of the LSAT for various reasons. So throughout this presentation, I will only speak about the LSAT. LSAC is also the organization that creates the LSAT. So you also must register for the LSAT via LSAC in order to take that exam. So again, to set up an LSAC account, as well as to register for the LSAT, simply visit www.lsac.org. All right, so the CAS report. This is the file that contains your hard factors again, your LSAT score and your GPA, but it also contains some soft factors. It contains a writing sample that is completed as a part of your LSAT exam, as well as your letters of recommendation that professors or others write on your behalf. So essentially everything that someone other than you has to say about you is contained in this file. The information found here is often considered a bit more objective than what's found in the EAPP because it comes from people other than you. There are a few key things to know when it comes to each of these documents and how to really leverage them or how they're actually reviewed by an admissions committee. So first, your LSAT score sheet is a list of all the LSAT scores in the order in which you receive them. It is something that schools use to figure out what your LSAT score is. It will also indicate if you were absent or cancel an LSAT score. If you take the LSAT multiple times, do know that most schools are going to put the most weight on your highest score. So oftentimes that's the only score that matters. But there are some schools in some instances where your scores will be average. So that is something to keep in mind. Also, if there is a 4-point or more difference between your lowest LSAT score and your highest LSAT score, that is usually viewed as an irregularity and will likely cause admissions officers to raise an eyebrow. So if you have more than a 4-point or more difference in your highest LSAT score and your lowest LSAT score, please make sure to write an addendum to explain that discrepancy, what you attribute that change in your score to. If not, schools will really question, or most likely will question what's going on there. Next, know that your transcripts from every school you attend must be submitted when you're applying to law school. So admissions committees are going to be able to see what you majored in, what sorts of classes you took, how easy or hard your classes were, whether there was an upward or downward trend in your grades, and whether you withdrew from a lot of classes or had a really bad semester at any point. Worth noting, if you were a STEM major, then it's often expected that your GPA will be a bit lower than a school's median, so don't be discouraged by that. Also know that STEM majors are in high demand by law schools right now, so I just want to throw that out in case any of you were STEM majors. Also, your graduate degree, if you get a graduate degree, know that law schools will also see and look at those transcripts too. But a graduate GPA is never used in lieu of an undergraduate GPA. I think that sometimes students think that getting a graduate degree is a good way to offset an undergraduate GPA. But the truth is the best way to offset a low GPA is to always try to get a good LSAT score and vice versa. Of course, there are limits to this, and I'll discuss that a bit later, but do know that that is really the best way to offset either a low LSAT score or a low GPA to get a high score or a high GPA to make up for the other number. So after your LSAT score and transcripts, the immediate next thing that a school sees in your CAS report is your writing sample. Over the years, I've heard rumors that these aren't actually read, but despite the rumors, these are really read by schools, and they're used to assess your basic writing skills and your analytical skills. So when thinking about how to stand out in the holistic review process, one key to having a good writing sample is to make sure that you provide arguments both for and against whatever conclusion you form while writing your writing sample. So for example, if you get a prompt that asks you to decide whether renovating a house or buying a new house is better based on the facts given, know that there technically is no right or wrong answers, and schools simply want to see how you work the facts to support your argument and whether you are also able to acknowledge and present counter arguments as well. The last thing that schools see when looking at your CAS report are your letters of recommendation. When it comes to the holistic review, these can really make a difference in helping you stand apart or woo a school. So while most law schools do prefer at least one academic letter, if you've been out of school for 3, sometimes 2 or more years, schools typically understand if you've lost touch with professors or are unable to get an academic letter. Also, know that academic letters aren't limited just to professors. You can get them from teaching assistants, academic advisors, thesis coordinators, or others that can speak on your behalf about what you are like as a student. Outside of academic letters, other kinds of letters of recommendation that you can submit include letters from advisors of any clubs or extracurricular activities you participated in, coaches, work supervisors, volunteer supervisors, co-workers, community leaders, etc. Essentially, the people that you want to avoid trying to get a letter of recommendation from are namely people like your mom's best friend, your cousin, or others that may come off as not very objective when talking about you. The EAPP, again, is the second document that a school will receive on your behalf. And there are 3 things that are typically required by schools that serve as the main components of most EAPPs. So those are your application, your personal statement, and your resume. There are also parts of your EAPP that are either optional or required on a case-by-case basis. Those may include a diversity statement, optional essays such as a Why XYZ school essay, and addenda. The application portion of your EAPP is typically very simple to fill out. The key thing that I want you to know about this part of your application, though, is that sometimes schools include optional questions on them, such as questions about your socioeconomic background, your parents' highest level of education, your parents' occupation, household income, etc. And from a holistic review stance, it's usually always going to be to your benefit to answer these kinds of questions. Although if you plan on writing an addendum about something like your LSAT score, but a school provides a question in the application itself that asks about your LSAT score, please know that it's usually better to simply answer the question on the application than to do an addendum, even if that means just copying and pasting what you would have put in your addendum. Next, your personal statement is one of the main staples of your application. So like your letters of recommendation, because of the holistic review, this can really sway an admissions committee one way or another on your behalf. So the key thing to know about your personal statement is that by the time the admissions committee is done reading it, they should have a sense of why you want to go to law school. So you can actually talk about any number of things in this essay, such as what you're passionate about and why, your upbringing or what led you to this point in your life, or even an event that served as a catalyst or the motivating factor behind you wanting to become a lawyer. So something like working for Justice Corps and having a significant experience with a client is something that you can possibly write a personal statement about. You should be careful though, because your personal statement should not be simply a recital of your resume. It does need to tell a story. So just make sure that you're balancing what you're saying when you're writing your personal statement. Many schools only allow a 2-page personal statement, while other schools allow a 3-page essay, and some even have no page limit. So the key regardless is knowing, what the rules are for each specific school that you're applying to and what their specific prompt and instructions say. I personally like to encourage students to try to write a 2-page essay that they can use for most of their applications, but you obviously have the discretion to write an essay that is however long the school will allow. A resume is typically the 3rd component of an EAPP that is usually required by most schools. Although some schools do make the resume optional, most admissions officers will advise you to always submit a resume, whether it's optional or not. So the key thing to know about your law school resume is that it's not like a professional resume in the sense that you only include information that's relevant to the role you're applying to. You don't have to include law-related stuff. Obviously, all of you have a law-related role, but if you have friends applying to law school that have never done anything law-related, that's perfectly okay. A law school resume is actually the opposite of a professional resume in the sense that you ought to include every single thing that you have done since starting college on your resume. So everything that you've done outside being a student needs to be on your resume. And so when thinking about this from a holistic review lens, the purpose of your resume is essentially to show that you're well-rounded, can multitask, have done more than just being a student, and in some circumstances that you don't come from a privileged background. And so those are the things to think about as you're writing your resume. And then after these 3 main components of the EAPP, there are a few more items that I stated earlier that your EAPP may or may not contain. So those 3 items may include a diversity statement, a Why XYZ school essay, or other school-specific essays, such as a 250-word essay if you're applying to Yale Law. That's actually required for Yale and not optional, but obviously not every application is going to have that, as well as any addenda. So for many first-generation, low-income, and minority students, a diversity statement is actually a really great essay to consider writing. And so forms of diversity or hardship, typically worth talking about, include but are not limited to the following. So coming from a low socioeconomic background, having a personal or familial immigration story, overcoming tragedy, experiencing discrimination, thriving despite having a disability, etc. Also, students often wonder whether or not they should personalize each personal statement to speak to the specific schools that they are applying to. In my honest opinion, unless the school's personal statement prompt asks you to do that, then you shouldn't. I say this in part because one, is not necessary. Most students admitted to law schools don't do this. Second, I say this because while working at UCLA Law, one of the easiest ways for a good application to end up on the wait list rather than in the admit pile was by telling me in their personal statement why they really wanted to attend USC School of Law or the law school across town. And so many times students really do make the mistake of forgetting to change out a school's name and sending the wrong essay to law schools. And so the consequences of that mistake simply don't outweigh the benefits of saying the right school name. So I usually ask students, why risk it? And besides, if you really want to expound upon why you want to go to a specific law school, you often have the option of writing an optional essay that I refer to as the Why XYZ School essay. And in this essay, you can spell out and explain why exactly you believe any given school is the best place for you to be at. After reading your essays, schools next see any addenda that you have written. Typically, students will write an addendum when there is something that they want to explain, such as less than ideal undergraduate grades, not doing as well on the LSAT as they were expecting to, or any other blemishes in their file. The key thing to know about LSAT and grade explanation addenda is that schools rarely perceive what you write as you making excuses. Rather, they view what you write as providing important context. So, for example, if you did poorly your first 2 years of undergrad because you had to work 2 jobs or because you're a first generation student and you simply didn't know how to study properly, you should tell the school that, because there is no way that they're going to know that unless you simply tell them. Students also may write addendum because they're required to make certain character and fitness disclosures. So the key thing to know about writing character and fitness disclosures is that it's important to first state the facts. Secondly, be honest and forthcoming. And third, explain any lessons learned or growth that has transpired since the incident took place. So also know that not all jurisdictions and not all schools require the same kinds of disclosures. So for example, some schools may require you to disclose any debt or credit information, while others don't. Some schools require you to disclose every arrest, whereas others require you only to disclose arrests that led to a conviction. And so just make sure that you read character and fitness questions for each school carefully, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to over disclose. So definitely pay attention to what sort of information a school is asking you for and provide only that. The caveat is, in the instance of genuinely being confused and not knowing whether a school would want you to disclose something or not, definitely err on the side of disclosure. As a final note, I do want to note that with your EAPP as well as your CAS report, when schools receive your application materials, they come in as 2 large PDFs. So the first PDF is the CAS report, and the second PDF is the EAPP, which contains all your essays, your addendum, everything. So because of the fact that this is one continuous file, please remember to put headers on top of all of your essays and addenda. Elsewise, it can be really hard, if not next to impossible, for a school to know which essay they're reading or where one document ends and another begins.